Hey everybody, my name is Bryce and today I'm going to be showing you how you can develop a simple and effective study plan to score well in the MCAT. So if you've looked on the internet at all, you probably understand that the MCAT is a much different test than you may have taken in the past. And so it requires a much different approach. So I'm going to walk through what I did to score in the 98th percentile and give some tips from my studying experience, and especially how to balance studying with school and work. Now, like other videos that are similar to this, it's important to keep in mind that your study schedule should be tailored to you and what works best for you. So you should understand what you can handle and what strategies work well for you as you go through them. So before I jump into the specifics, I'm going to just give a general outline of what is going to be covered in this video. We're going to start with just the basic what's on the test and what can you expect. Then I'll jump into what I did for studying in the timeline that I went through. And then I'll look at the resources in a little more detail that I used and that I recommend. And then we'll wrap it up and I'll discuss what I found to be effective in terms of balancing studying for the MCAT as well as working and being a full-time student. Okay, so to begin, what is on the MCAT? What are you dealing with when you walk into the testing center? So this test is a 7-hour test that's broken into 4 sections, each about an hour and a half with some breaks in between. First section is going to be your chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, and then you move into your critical analysis and reasoning skills, so basically the English part of the test. But then you go to your biology and biochemical foundations of living systems, and lastly your psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. So this test is scored on a scale from 472 to 528, with the median being at 500. Each of the sections is scored from 118 to 132, which add up to those totals. Now you might think that your pre-med coursework of classes like organic chemistry and physics and biochemistry will help you do well in this test, which they will, but they're unfortunately not enough. This test is really a jack of all trades, master of none type of situation where there's a lot of different topics. None of them go super in depth, but you have to cover your bases. And so that is why content review is so stressed for the beginning stages of studying. One other point I will mention is if you're looking online or talking to your friends, one of the things you'll hear often is that there's no low yield content on the test, basically meaning that they can test you on anything that is in their content outline, which I will link in the description below, that goes through everything they have that they can test you on basically. And so this is true, but you'll also find that there's high yield info, stuff that you're more likely to be tested on. And so it's important to focus on those things first while keeping in mind that there's a lot of stuff that you have to cover and you're probably not going to cover all of it. There's many times when I was studying where I would encounter information in my last practice test that I had never seen before, and I'd been studying for months. So it's just kind of the nature of the test, but that is kind of a general outline of how the test is structured, what to expect when you go in for test day. So I'm going to quickly go over what I did for my timeline. Just for a little background, I am a junior and I'm planning on going straight through to medical school. I'm not planning on taking a gap year, which means I had to study when I was working over the summer and then while I was in school. So I just took my test in January, which was last month, January of 2025. And I started studying in June of 2024, which put me at a little over 7 months of study time. And the way I broke that up was the first 4 months from about June until October was content review, which is a little longer than you'll hear some people do it or recommend it, but that's what worked for me. And then I did about 3 months of practice questions. So from about September to December, January was practice questions, with December and January all being AAMC content exclusively, which I'll get into in the next section. Like I said before, this is going to be tailored to you, and so a lot of people recommend 2 to 3 months of dedicated study time. And if you're in my position and you don't have the luxury of solely dedicating yourself to the test, stretching that out to 5 or 6 months is, I think, a pretty good spot. One thing that worked for me is my test was right after my winter break, and so I had all of December and the beginning of January to study for the test exclusively. Like I said, if you can do it full-time, 2 to 3 months, and then if you can't, stretching that out a little longer is probably the way to go. Okay, so that is it for my timeline. So jumping into the resources that I used and I recommend using for this test. In terms of content review, the biggest things for me were the Kaplan Books, which I actually have here. So these things, they're great. They got a lot of good information, and they differ from year to year, but I'm pretty sure it's the same information that you'll see in 2019 that you'll see in 2024. So they're great for just going through and annotating them. Like I said, it took me about 4 months to go through, trying to do as many chapters as I could per week, which is usually about 2 or 3, and there is 6 books, so it is kind of a lot, so it takes a little bit, and part of the reason it took me a longer time is because I was trying to do the Anki with it, which I'll touch on in a second. But the books are great. Take your time, go through them, and one of the things I recommend is if you don't understand anything in the books, to go on Khan Academy and go to their MCAT section, which I'll also link, and look at any of their supplemental videos that they have on there. I know specifically for me, immunology was new, and so I had to go look on their videos to kind of actually understand what was being talked about in the book and on my Anki, because it was all brand new information to me. So using that as a supplemental resource is definitely recommended. So that's it for the Kaplan Books and most of content review. The other kind of side of content review is Anki, which you'll kind of do throughout your time studying. At least that's what I did and what I recommend. So Anki is a flashcard software that basically functions to combat what's known as the forgetting curve. And the way it does this is by presenting you with cards in a deck and you clicking whether or not it's an easy card, a difficult card, or somewhere in between. And depending on what you click, it'll give it to you in certain time intervals. And these time intervals will vary, but you're going to stack up cards over time that you'll see every day you do cards. So it's kind of, once you start, you kind of got to keep going with it to keep up with it. But as long as you're consistent and don't let the cards pile up, which if you've never used Anki, again, you'll understand how it works once you start using it, but you got to make it a habit basically. But it's super helpful, great way to reinforce the information and truly understand what you're reading in the books. And so the deck that I used was called JackSparrow. And if you use JackSparrow's deck, the main key takeaway for that is to just focus on the main idea of each card and don't get too caught up in the details, because there's about 6,000 cards in that deck. So the other deck I recommend using for psychology and sociology specifically is Mr. Pankow's deck. And that corresponds to what's known as the Khan Academy document, which is a 300-page document that is a substitution for the Kaplan book. There's also a condensed 86-page document that goes over pretty much everything as well, which I will link below. And so substituting that for the Kaplan book is not a bad idea, but basically that Anki deck that I mentioned corresponds with those documents, not the book. But it's the best for psychology and sociology for sure. These are all pre-made decks that are typically found on the MCAT subreddit. So if you go there, it's a great resource. And so then for the worst section on the test, cars, I recommend using Westin, which is a website that I'll link below as well. And it's basically a free resource, which is great. It costs no money, and they post daily cars passages, as well as you have access to past passages that were posted, and you also have access to other topics besides cars as well that they post. So all their stuff is free. And so what I would do is I would go on every day and do their daily cars passage and then do one from before. So I would do 2 cars passages per day, which usually took about 30 minutes. The whole point of this is to understand the logic and process of cars and figure out what strategy works best for you, because cars is kind of tough. And I would start out untimed doing the passages, just going through them to your speed and really trying to get the questions right. And as you start getting more and more right, you can start to time yourself and aim for under 10 minutes. Next is practice questions. And for those, I used UWorld, which is an online platform that has a question bank of about 3,000 questions. And for that, I used it for everything except cars, because I was using Westin for cars. But UWorld has some great graphics and explanations for their questions. I started during the school year, during the semester when I was taking classes. So I was doing about 30 questions per day during the week and about 50 on the weekend. So I try to hit around 200 questions per week, and that varies from week to week, but I ended up doing about half the question bank. So as much of that as you can get done. They have some great questions to really start applying what you've learned in your content review and on your Anki. And I recommend whatever questions you do get wrong on UWorld to go back and make your own Anki cards to really understand why you got it wrong and what to do next time to get it right. But yeah, that's it for practice questions. And then lastly, we have practice tests. And so these practice tests are going to be your biggest help in terms of understanding how the test is actually going to be formatted when you go to take it, and understanding kind of where you're at in terms of your progress. And so for me, I took 5 full-length tests and 1 diagnostic. I took my diagnostic towards the beginning of my studying time just to see where I was at. And then I took 4 per week leading up to my actual test day. In terms of the resources to use for the practice tests, I used Blueprint for the first 2, so they offer a free diagnostic test and then a free full-length test. And so using those for your first 2 is definitely my recommendation. And then the last 4, I used the AAMC ones. And so this gets me into my final point of this section, which is using AAMC content right before your test. And basically they offer question packs, section banks, and practice tests. You do have to buy them. They offer, I believe, 1 free scored practice test and 1 free unscored, but they also offer 4 scored that you pay for, which I highly recommend because they are the ones that make the test. So their materials are definitely worth buying and investing in if you are going to buy anything. So I saved all of the study materials that they offered for the last month and used them exclusively. And so you'll find the question packs are a little easier to get through, and they'll give you practice on each subject specifically. So physics, biology, chemistry, each has their own question pack. And the section banks are a little different. There are 300 questions, and I believe there's 2 volumes now. And those are a little harder, more representative of what you'll see on a real test. And then the practice tests are obviously the best resource to use. But like I said, it's important to simulate that real environment and to understand what you got wrong in the full lengths, to review them thoroughly. And I recommend making Anki cards for the questions you got wrong. Well, that may not be covered on your Anki prior or any content review or practice questions you've seen. And so lastly, I just want to talk about how I balanced my studying time with school and work and what advice I have for that. When I started studying, I was working full-time during the summer. And so it was hard to really stick to a consistent schedule for content review because the books are pretty dense and it's hard to get through them. And then as soon as I stopped working, I transitioned to full-time classes. So it was definitely hard to maintain studying with all of that. But I would just say that it's important to not overwork yourself and to make sure you're giving the best effort you can to each thing you do. Prioritizing, making a good structured plan, and being organized are the best things you can do. It is going to be hard and it's not easy. I think for me, throughout the school year, 60% of my time was going towards the MCAT and 40% was going towards classes. So I did prioritize the MCAT a little more, but I was still able to do good at my classes. Again, it just takes the prioritization and organization are really the 2 biggest things, in addition to having a good support system around you, which can never be understated. So that is it for what I had to say. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. I will be posting videos in the future that go into a little more detail on the more nuanced side of the studying. But the last thing I will say is it is very difficult. It is not an easy process. Having a good structured study plan and having those supportive people around you will make the difference. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.